Chapter 126 The Arbat Incident, Part 5. In the Stark Towers laboratory, Dr. Connors was leading a group of researchers working overtime when his phone rang. He answered, "Hello? I'm very busy right now. We can talk later. This is Nick. How's the serum research going? The research sample is insufficient. You must provide me with at least 3 more vampires. I am researching serum. You can't expect me to conjure it out of thin air without even providing a blood sample. Can you? I will contact the battlefield commander." Nick's voice was calm. He said, "How confident are you that you can break the vampire's healing ability?" While organizing research data, Dr. Connors said into the phone, "It's not certain yet, but it's more likely that even if this effect takes effect, it won't be permanent. This is a completely new field. I have never encountered this kind of monster before. There is a mysterious factor in their blood that I cannot fully decipher yet. I can only tell you that the kind of effect you are imagining is probably unlikely to occur. But we must crack their self-healing ability, otherwise this battle is almost impossible to fight." The group of vampires who initially controlled the streets of Brooklyn and Queens numbered over 300. We severely wounded half of them, but they soon recovered to over 200. Meanwhile, our armed police force was reduced from over 300 to 60. Most of them sustained only minor injuries but were unable to continue fighting and had to retreat to await reinforcements. With such a disparity in manpower, the longer it drags on, the less we can fight. Connors spoke quickly as he explained to Nick, "They are a magical creation, and you should know that better than I do. I may not be able to completely decipher one of their abilities using scientific methods. As for making their self-healing abilities disappear completely, I can only tell you that it's impossible. But I actually have a better idea. If successful, we might not only be able to crack one of their abilities, but we could even render them incapable of fighting." "Then what are you waiting for? What do you need?" "Research samples, right? I'll contact Spider-Man right now and have him capture a few and send them to you." A while later, Dr. Connors heard a loud crash at the window. Spider-Man had crashed into the glass of Stark Tower, and then he used a web to stick to the window next to him to prevent himself from sliding down. He dragged a large black net with 2 or 3 bats still struggling inside. He opened the window with great difficulty and pulled the net in. Dr. Connors stood in front of him with his arms crossed and said, "Couldn't you have knocked them out first before bringing them in?" "I'm sorry, Doctor, because I didn't know if you wanted them to be completely alive. You know, if I punched them, their heads might be unusable." Connors thought he had a point, and then he said, "Are you trying to run off to the battlefield again? Let me tell you, no way. Stay here and help me finish the first phase of research before you can leave." "But we have a big plan to do. We intend to." "Listen, I don't care what you're planning to do. All I know is that, given the current situation, it doesn't make much difference whether you're here or not. But if you stay in the lab, we might be able to solve this problem at its root." But Peter was a little dejected. He knew that Dr. Connors was right. The plan to blow up the Brooklyn Bridge is no longer needed for him. Just now, Stark has entered the fray. He can command unmanned mechs to launch suicide attacks. At this stage of the war, the power that an individual soldier can exert is no longer significant. With fighter jets entering the fray and special operations forces beginning their operations, the entire battlefield has now entered the brink of a strategic counteroffensive. What follows is a large-scale brawl, also known as a bombardment. Spider-Man might be able to use his superhuman strength to collect some fries on the battlefield, but the effectiveness of individual heroes in such large-scale operations has been reduced to a minimum. Apart from Iron Man's mech and explosives, and Quake's group attacks, the other superheroes and agents have basically retreated to the edge of the battlefield to carry out rescue work. Reason told Peter that the laboratory needed him more right now. In the past, Spider-Man would have been itching to get involved in such a big scene, and even if he stayed in one place, he would feel like he had thorns growing on his butt. But this time, Peter calmed down quickly. He took off the hood almost without hesitation and then planned to change his clothes and go into the laboratory. Connors was somewhat surprised. He had already decided to be patient with children and try to appease Peter first. He also knew that few boys of this age could resist the temptation of being a hero in a large-scale war. After all, a hero is always behind the scenes. No one would not want to attract more attention. Connors knew Peter's personality all along. Perhaps it was because his other identity had been suppressed for too long in daily life. As Spider-Man, Peter really loved to show off. Peter changed his clothes, walked in, and said directly, "Where do we begin? Do you have any preliminary materials I can see?" Connors handed him some of the documents, And to everyone's surprise, Peter actually found a place to sit down and started reading them seriously. Connors watched his retreating figure. Although Peter's physique had become much stronger than before, he was still just a teenager, which was quite inconsistent with his current calm demeanor. Connors said, "Now that I think about it, you're only 16 years old. Perhaps we've been a bit too demanding of you. I remember when I was 16, I used to skip school every day and hang out with a bunch of people. Back then, I thought everything was fun as long as I was away from school. Even the telephone poles on the main road looked better than those in school." Peter looked up in surprise and said, "I thought you were a good student." Dr. Connors smiled and shook his head, saying, "Actually, I only started studying in college. I was just messing around in high school." Then he said with some emotion, "When I was admitted to Harvard Medical School, I was a little dissatisfied. If I hadn't been admitted, I could have studied abroad. But Harvard Medical School is good too, so I stayed." Peter swallowed hard, immediately lowered his head, and began to bury himself in his books. This research project was actually commissioned by Nick to Stark. Nick was well aware of how rare this opportunity was. The members of Congress had made a rare concession and approved the use of large-scale heavy firepower against the vampire invasion of New York. Therefore, they had to act quickly and solve the vampire problem at its root. If the process drags on for too long, it will give the moderates room to maneuver, which is something the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. desperately wants to avoid. The problem of dealing with vampires has always fallen on S.H.I.E.L.D.'s shoulders. But dealing with these things is a thankless task. If Nick Fury hadn't had some conscience, anyone else probably wouldn't have bothered with it at all. These things are very troublesome. They have two forms, can use magic, and have extremely strong self-healing abilities. Unless they are completely blown out of the head or have their hearts pierced, they will recover very quickly. Even high-level agents may be in danger when facing them. But it was S.H.I.E.L.D.'s duty to deal with this creature. Nick Fury hated this kind of bill that involved a lot of investment, little return, and no reimbursement, so he naturally wanted to take this opportunity to solve the problem once and for all. He also knew very well that machine guns and cannons alone could not completely eliminate these creatures. He hoped to approach the problem from a biological perspective and have the genius Stark create a biological weapon for him, ideally one that could turn all the vampires into humans. If that wasn't possible, then he would abolish their special abilities. So the brilliant Stark simply passed the project on to Connors, while Iron Man had other things to do. Ever since that day when Stark was inspired by Schiller and had a sudden burst of inspiration, he has been tinkering around in the lab with boundless creativity, making Coulson and Hill tremble with fear, afraid that if they weren't careful, Stark would create a massive steel torrent or an omnic crisis. Even more terrified than them were the members of Congress who had watched Stark's speech video. Hill's video was exceptionally well shot. She completely missed capturing Schiller's warning to Stark, instead starting the recording directly from the climax of Stark's speech. Throughout the video, Stark acts like a mad genius scientist, passionately describing his dangerous ideas that could destroy the world at any moment. Stark becomes frantic and neurotic when discussing matters in his field of expertise, a common trait among geniuses. He went on and on about his crazy ideas, muttering a string of technical terms that normal people couldn't understand, and occasionally spouting things like machines dominating the world, inorganic matter conquering everything, and carbon-based life being trash. Just watching this video would certainly terrify the lawmakers, because they know very well that Stark is capable of doing these things. Everyone knows that the predicament Stark is facing is mostly because he has set a bottom line for himself and is unwilling to use unconventional methods to deal with his opponents. Otherwise, let alone the military, even if all the forces on Capitol Hill were united, they would not be able to stop Stark's Jaeger army. They actually had no way to completely stop Stark. Everything depended on Stark's own moral compass. The military and lawmakers had considered what to do if Stark went insane one day, but the answer was that there was nothing they could do but pray he didn't. They all knew that even if Stark Industries went bankrupt and Stark ended up on the streets, if you gave Stark a junkyard, he could still return a Gundam army to you a few days later. The situation in Afghanistan was so dire, yet Stark still managed to escape in the end. Therefore, they lifted almost all restrictions on S.H.I.E.L.D., granting Nick Fury full authority and ordering him to immediately and ruthlessly resolve the vampire invasion, leaving Stark with no excuse to retaliate. In their view, Stark's speech was not just about vampires. These politicians love to make their own assumptions. In their view, it's because the military oppressed Stark too much recently that Stark is warning them like this, telling them that he has the power to destroy the world. The Senator's choice to confront the vampire issue head-on and eliminate these creatures by any means necessary is also a way of telling Stark that as long as he is willing to maintain his moral bottom line, they can help him maintain that bottom line. He doesn't have to use any abilities outside of that bottom line, so everyone can live a good life. Of course, Stark couldn't be bothered to think about all that. He was currently on the battlefield, commanding his fleet of Jaegers to wreak havoc. Chapter 127, The Arbat Incident, Part 6. Above the Brooklyn Bridge, Rhodes, clad in his mech, swiftly flew over the heads of ground troops, then slammed a bat that was trying to ambush him to the ground and punched it twice. After receiving the signal from Stark in the sky, Chief George raised one hand and shouted into the communications equipment, "Attention! Prepare to begin suppressive fire. Force them off the bridge." Captain America Steve Rogers swung his shield, knocking back two humanoid vampires beside him. Then, feigning defeat, he jumped off the bridge with his shield, and the two vampires, of course, followed without a second thought. In their eyes, the guy carrying the shield was just a little stronger than an ordinary person. If the shield hadn't been so hard, they would have already broken through Steve's defenses. Seeing that the advantage was in his favor, the two vampires were hot on Steve's heels, completely unaware that several strange-looking mechs were rushing toward the bridge pier above their heads. Natasha stood on the roof of a truck behind the line of fire, watching Stark's self-destructing mechs ready to go. She said, "Listen, this is the order of the explosions. Pier 1 is badly damaged, so we can leave it for now. The aftershocks will destroy it. We need to blow up the strongest pier first, all in one go, without giving those bats under the bridge any time to react." Stark said from the sky, "Jaegers 4 and 5 are in position, ready to begin the demolition. Jarvis, calculate the blast radius." Explosion zone confirmed. All friendly forces evacuated. Flight trajectory calculated. Preparing for demolition. 3, 2, 1. Stark floated above the Brooklyn Bridge, watching several streaks of light rush towards the bottom of the bridge. The moment they touched the piers, flames erupted, and a violent explosion pounded in the ears. Bricks were blasted hundreds of meters into the air, and the entire bridge collapsed with a roar. The rising smoke and dust temporarily obscured all details of the battlefield. Jarvis's voice crackled through the walkie-talkies. "Demolition successfully completed, achieving the expected results. We can proceed to the next phase of operations." "How many enemy troops were killed?" Stark asked. According to the bioscanning data from the surrounding mechs, the bridge collapse resulted in the deaths of 132 vampires, and approximately 120 vampires remain seriously injured and are recovering. Before Jarvis could finish speaking, Natasha shouted, "Record their location. Send it to the night vision mask. Take out these heavily wounded vampires immediately." Stark clicked his tongue in the sky. He had just witnessed a bat whose wings had been pierced by nails, but after struggling and flapping its wings a couple of times, it managed to break free from under the two large rocks that were pinning it down. Within minutes, it was able to fly erratically again. "This self-healing ability is deadly. I hope Connors can hurry up. If this keeps going, it'll never end," Stark said. But the situation on the battlefield is still improving. With the cooperation of fighter jets and ground special forces, the cover of heavy firepower, and the infiltration of Stark armored units, the vampires' formation has been severely disrupted. The bridge explosion wiped out most of their manpower, leaving only some high-ranking vampires to put up a last-ditch resistance. The strategic counteroffensive phase has begun in full swing. The human defense line is advancing continuously, with the flashes of machine guns and the explosions of grenades coming one after another, and sharp screams echoing from the ground from time to time. Blade, wielding an assault rifle, fired a burst of bullets and blew the head off a high-ranking vampire. He took a deep drag on his cigarette, then tossed the butt under his foot and stomped it out, saying, "Looks like it won't take more than 3 days. I can take care of them tonight." As soon as he finished speaking, he sensed something was wrong. A red light suddenly appeared on the rooftop of a building in Brooklyn. Immediately afterwards, the beam of red light began to take on a tangible form, slowly forming a bat pattern. Stark, of course, saw this scene and frowned, saying, "What's that? Why are people putting on a light show on the battlefield?" Blade Runner cursed under his breath, grabbed the walkie-talkie, and shouted, "They're performing that mysterious ritual. Stop them." Before he could finish speaking, Captain America sprinted at supersonic speed and then made a huge leap, landing on the rooftop. But it was too late. Steve saw a huge, mysterious magic circle on the rooftop, but there was no one there. "How do I destroy this thing?" Steve asked. Before he could finish speaking, screams erupted across the battlefield. All the vampires illuminated by the red bat's light let out inhuman screams. Their faces contorted in agony as they began to transform into bat forms. The bats they conjured this time were quite different from the original large bats. Each of them had a wingspan of over 10 meters, with sharp spikes growing from the wing skeletons, and their fangs growing longer and longer. Their originally normal bat faces had also transformed into hideous and terrifying monster shapes. More importantly, the red light in their eyes began to intensify, and then they collectively lost their minds and began to attack everyone around them indiscriminately. Even the high-ranking vampires were not spared, except that the bat monsters they transformed into were surrounded by thick black mist. Several policemen who inhaled a little of that black mist immediately clutched their necks and collapsed. "Quick! Put on your gas masks! Hurry!" Chief George shouted. But it was already too late. The police officers who had inhaled the black mist began to struggle, and wings sprouted from their backs, turning them into crazed bat monsters. Previously, vampire attacks also had the ability to infect, but the conversion rate was relatively slow. Once an infection was detected, these individuals would be immediately removed from the battlefield to receive treatment. But the officers who inhaled the black mist were transformed into bat-like monsters almost instantly, without even a chance to receive treatment. Chief George, his eyes red-rimmed, roared angrily, "Open fire! Indiscriminate attack! Smash these monsters!" Iron Man accelerated at full speed, grabbed a bat-like monster and swooped down, then fired a shot into the bat's head. Instead of stopping its struggle, the monster became increasingly frenzied. "They're being controlled by something," Stark said. "Damn it, a headshot isn't even a fatal wound." Blade's voice came through the walkie-talkie. "That's the power of immortality. Burn them. Burn them to ashes. That's the only way to kill them. Quick, prepare the flamethrowers." But no one expected this change in the situation. Flamethrowers, an unconventional weapon, were not equipped by any combat unit. The mutated bats have become much more powerful. Headshots and heart piercings are no longer effective against them. They are also larger, stronger, and incredibly ferocious, showing no fear and only capable of attacking. The tide of battle turned in an instant, with humanity being pushed back step by step. Even Stark was struggling to keep up with the onslaught of these crazed bat monsters. Finally, after being bumped by another bat, Stark angrily shouted, "Jarvis, connect me to my lab in Stark Tower." A familiar voice came from the other end of the line. Schiller said, "I'm working on a research project with Connors. What's up? Manually disable the highest level of security protocol for me," Stark said in a deep voice. "Are you sure? Didn't you say you'd wait until the battle was hopelessly lost before doing this? We're already at our wits' end." Stark watched as more and more humans were transformed into bat-like monsters, the overwhelming hordes of creatures almost blocking out all the moonlight. He said, "Quick! This is no longer the time to consider costs." Schiller took the phone, walked to a hatch in the lab, entered a code Stark had given him, and went inside. There was only one lever inside. Schiller first placed his hand on the screen, and after hearing 2 beep sounds, he pulled the lever down. Immediately afterwards, a beam of light, like a beacon, began to rotate on the roof of Stark Tower. The hatch of a weapons depot on the top floor opened, and dozens of mechs loaded with heavy weapons flew out. Most importantly, 2 enormous steel monsters stepped out. One of them looked very much like the one Obadiah had piloted before, and the other was somewhat similar to General Johnson's tentacle steel monster, but with some differences clearly having been modified. The 2 enormous steel monsters emerged, leaped directly from the rooftop of Stark Tower to the rooftop of another building, and then sped toward the battlefield. With the arrival of 2 giant mechs, the fierce battle situation was somewhat alleviated. These steel monsters are large enough to operate both on the ground and in midair. They can tear a bat to shreds once they catch it. Moreover, the steel monster that Obadiah piloted was equipped with a flamethrower, which he used to kill many of the crazed bats. As a result, just as the battle was beginning to turn around, more vampires joined the fight. It seemed that their commander had deliberately chosen this moment. As soon as these vampires rushed into the battlefield, they were irradiated by the red light and turned into even more frenzied bats. Even Iron Man and his Jaeger team had to retreat temporarily to avoid a direct confrontation. Connors received a call from Stark, who said, "Connors, when are your reinforcements coming? We're almost at our breaking point here." Peter, holding the test tube, said, "Doctor, I think we're close to success. This serum should temporarily disable a vampire's healing ability. That's right, but the premise is that we must inflict effective damage on them within the duration of this effect, which means we must first take back the position. Peter looked up at Connors and saw him take out a syringe. Peter said, "Wait, Doctor, what's that? It can't be." On the battlefield, Stark dove down, tearing apart a bat's wing. Blood splattered onto his mech, and he cursed, "Damn, that's filthy." Before he could finish speaking, the bat's wings began to grow back. Steve was almost buried in a swarm of bats. He struggled to hold up his shield and managed to knock one of the bats far away, but it flew back a short while later. Hawkeye hid behind a bridge wreckage, rapidly drawing his bow and firing arrows. His arm trembled slightly. Next to him, Quake slammed her fist into the ground, sending the bats that tried to ambush them flying. Natasha provided tactical support from behind with binoculars. "Iron Man, back off. They!" Before Natasha could finish shouting, Stark was pounced on by a much larger bat. The bat's fangs bit into the left arm of his mech, and a burst of electricity shot out. Stark roared, "Activate the shock!" A powerful electric current erupted, paralyzing the bat. Stark seized the opportunity to escape, but before his mech could even take flight, the bat caught up with him again. The airflow from his wings made Stark's mech unstable, and he was about to be knocked down again when Steve swung his shield and struck one of the bat's wings. The bat tilted, and Stark took the opportunity to pull himself up. He said, "Thanks." "Behind you," Steve shouted. Stark had just turned his head when a violent gust of wind rushed towards him. Clearly, a bat had been lying in ambush nearby for a long time. Stark tried to dodge, but it was too late. The bat was too close. Stark said, "Activate the escape sequence. Then the mech self-destruct. If you leave now, you'll be at too high an altitude and your life will be in danger," Jarvis said. Stark glanced at Steve on the ground and said, "Activate the escape." Immediately, a figure was ejected from the mech. Immediately afterward, the mech erupted with intense lightning and then exploded, blasting both bats away. One of them was burned to a crisp. Steve leaped and caught Stark, then placed him on the ground. Before Stark could say anything, the two felt a huge shadow loom over them. As they turned around, Stark cursed, "What the hell is this?" Behind them, a gigantic green monster, over 10 meters tall, crushed the escaped bat into a bloody pulp with a single stomp. A lizard-like monster, as large as a small mountain, lowered its head, its enormous vertical pupils fixed on Stark, and flicked its tongue at him. "Your support has arrived." Chapter 128, The Arbat Incident, Part 7. Stark donned his light armor again and stood shoulder to shoulder with Steve. Captain America, shield in hand, stared at the enormous monster before him, swallowed hard, and said, "Don't tell me he was the one who invaded Stark Tower last time." Stark stared at the enormous shadow before him, swallowed hard, and said, "I think, maybe, perhaps." He stammered for a moment, then shouted, "Connors! Are you Connors? Can you understand us now?" "Of course, you don't need to shout so loudly. I'm not deaf," the giant lizard man said. "I used cryogenic technology to modify the lizard serum, extracting the part that causes humans to become lizards and modifying it to give me a larger size and greater strength. Most importantly, it allows me to maintain my sanity." Stark rubbed his neck, which was a little sore from looking up for so long, and said, "The improvement you've made is truly remarkable." Stark was right. Dr. Connors' lizard man was now over 10 meters tall, like a building. In addition to lizard scales, his joints had protruding spikes, and his spine was covered in sharp bone spurs. His huge vertical pupils made him look cruel and cold-blooded. "Wait, now that you're here, what about the experiment?" Stark asked. "I've handed it over to Peter. I believe he can handle it." After saying that, Connors sprinted and leaped onto the highest wreckage of the collapsed Brooklyn Bridge. Then, with a powerful flick of his tail, he sent several bats flying. Connors did indeed delegate the remaining research tasks to Peter, but Peter was clearly not in good condition. He said, "Wait, Doctor, you have to wear a lab coat to enter the lab. Hey, don't touch that test tube. You can't pour directly from the test tube." Schiller completely ignored him, picked up a test tube, and waved it in front of his eyes. Peter walked over, wearing gloves, carefully took the test tube from him and said, "Doctor, this violates laboratory regulations. We have to." "All right, If I could avoid violating lab regulations, I wouldn't have come in after Connors left. But Connors is gone. Forget about those serums. Let's get something more interesting. As he spoke, Peter saw Schiller pull out a stack of design drawings from somewhere. Peter took the drawings Schiller handed him, glanced at them and said, "What's this? A small-scale cryogenic generator? Isn't this the previous cryogenic technology?" "That's right. I had someone design a small-scale cryogenic device that can freeze any target within its range. So, this is a weapon? What's it for?" Schiller sat down, then tapped the table to signal Peter to sit down as well. He said, "The biggest problem now is that ordinary people can't deal with these monsters. What do you think would happen if everyone had a way to effectively subdue vampires?" "Those vampires are doomed to lose," Peter said without hesitation. "How many people are there in Brooklyn? Even excluding the vulnerable, just those who work out and know how to fight, there must be at least tens of thousands, right? Those bats are at most a few thousand." Then Peter, as if suddenly realizing something, said, "Yes, that's definitely a good idea. If we use ordinary guns, the vampires' healing abilities are too strong. Even if we cut several holes in their wings, it won't help. We need a weapon that can stop them from moving at all so that ordinary people can have a chance to fight back," Schiller explained. Peter continued Schiller's words. "Freezing can do that. Once a shot is fired, the bats are frozen into blocks of ice, so they can't do any harm to people. Besides, they aren't injured, so they won't trigger any self-healing abilities. They just can't move." Peter imagined the scene. Any able-bodied person could throw a cryogenic generator at a bat swooping down on them, and if the shot wasn't too off-target, it would basically disable the bat's mobility. Another advantage is that the bats that vampires transform into are very large, with wingspans often several meters. This would normally pose a greater danger to many people who fight them, because larger size means greater strength. Ordinary bullets can heal them within seconds, and even silver bullets can only slightly interfere with their movements. In the interval between shots, they will be pounced on by the bats. However, if they had a freezing device that could immediately control them, their large size would become their weakness because the larger they were, the easier it would be to hit them. Once hit, whether it was freezing a wing or other parts, they would definitely fall from mid-air immediately and lose their ability to move. Peter said, "The idea is good, but it will probably be difficult to implement." Looking at the design, he said, "This thing is too expensive to make and cannot be widely used." Schiller shrugged and said, "That's your problem. I'm just a regular psychologist." Peter stroked his chin. He could see that this equipment could bring about a huge change in the situation, but at the same time, it seemed to him like a rich man's toy. The cost of just one of these things was hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it was a one-time use item. Large-scale application would be a complete waste of money. Even if one could freeze a few bats, it would still be a huge loss. Could this have been designed by Mr. Stark? Well, he could use it like that, but if we were to make this device widely available, the exorbitant cost would drive director Nick crazy. Peter propped his head up with one hand, intently studying the design drawings, when Venom spoke in his mind. "I have an idea," Peter asked doubtfully. "You can even read mechanical design drawings?" "Of course I can. So what do you want to do? Miniaturization, individual deployment, routine deployment, we can—" Peter, sensing the brainwaves transmitted by Venom, said, "Of course, it would be great if we could achieve all of these points, but small arms also have many problems." Peter continued, "To reduce costs, the bullets used must be liquid stored, which is the best storage method for cryogenic technology. However, if liquid energy is converted into solid bullets, it takes a certain amount of time to fire. Those bats are very fast, and this delayed firing could very well result in the gunman being attacked before he can even fire a bullet. However, this weapon cannot use solid bullets, so this conversion process is necessary. Have you considered that attacks don't necessarily have to involve firing bullets?" Schiller said. "How about melee spray?" Peter paused for a moment, then said, "That makes sense. If a ranged attack requires a certain amount of preparation time, then we can also add a melee attack to this weapon. The preparation time required for spray is much shorter than that for solid bullets, and it can provide continuous output, making it very suitable for close combat." Then Peter seemed to have switched personalities. He focused intently on the design drawings and said, "We can design two attack methods for this gun. One is to fire ice spikes with delayed firing, and the other is to fire freezing spray at close range. This will basically solve the problem of alternating between long and short range." Peter stood up from his chair with the design drawings in hand and said, Both of these equipment options are worth considering. One is a freeze gun with 2 attack modes, and the other is a wide-area freezing device that can be used as a grenade. Ordinary personnel can be equipped with just the freeze gun, while elite personnel in the center of the battlefield can be equipped with some of the wide-area freezing devices. Schiller, sitting in his chair, clapped his hands and said, "You are about to become the savior of this war, Peter." "Okay, I'll try to make one now. Jarvis, are you there?" "Production Unit Number 2 is ready, Mr. Peter." Peter rubbed his hands together, saying excitedly, "This is the first time I've ever actually made a weapon. I didn't remember much of what Mr. Stark told me before, but now it's back in my head, and it's very clear." "That means you're a genius," Schiller said. "By the way, what do you plan to name this weapon system?" Peter hesitated for a moment, then said, "Although I've refined the idea, I don't think this was originally my idea. What are you going to call him?" "Doctor, how about calling it Blizzard?" "Blizzard? That would be perfect for that large-scale freezing device." "Then let's call it that." "Go ahead. I'll be waiting for your Blizzard Alpha Beta." After Peter left, Schiller answered Nick's call and said, "I'm almost done on my end. How's it going on your end?" "Those moderates have been lobbying the lawmakers. They've even taken it to the Security Council, but Pierce has held firm. I can only buy you 2 more days at most. You'd better hurry." After hanging up the phone, Stark, dressed in his mecha suit, hurriedly entered the laboratory. As soon as he entered, he saw Schiller scribbling on the lab table. Stark asked anxiously, "What's going on? Could those senators have really been persuaded by the vampires?" He opened his visor and said, "Chief George told me that someone has contacted him and told him to stop using large-scale firepower. Damn it, those bats are so crazy, and he's telling us not to fight back." "What's the situation on the battlefield now?" Schiller asked. "Not too optimistic." Stark gulped down a large glass of water, then slammed it down on the table. He was clearly in a bad mood. He said, "Dr. Lizard was a huge help. He tore apart a lot of bats and withstood most of the pressure on the front lines. And Captain America, I have to admit, Steve is quite the fighter. The 2 of us are cooperating quite well and can share most of the firepower on the flank, while the other flank is being held by SHIELD agents. It seems we can hold out for now, but this can't go on." "It's almost dawn," Schiller said. "If you hold on for one last wave of attacks, their offensive should weaken once the sun comes out. But the vampire hunter called Blade told me that these crazy bats, under the influence of a ritual, can even withstand weak sunlight. This does not mean that their mobility will not be reduced. Once daytime arrives, a large portion of the vampires will inevitably choose to lie dormant. Well, it seems the issues we need to address this day aren't on the battlefield. What on earth is Nick Fury doing? Why did he let those vampires gain the upper hand in public opinion?" Schiller, without looking up as he wrote, said, "You have to understand they have very close ties with human society, and there are many scholars, professors, and well-known figures among them. This time, our attitude was too tough, and many of them have united to try to influence our decisions from within." Stark sighed and said, "Many police officers were injured, and there were even more civilian casualties. Fortunately, our final battle took place near the bridge, not in a residential area. Otherwise, I don't even want to imagine how devastating the losses would have been. These monsters deserve to go to hell. Your battle is temporarily over, but another war awaits you. What's the meaning? This full-scale vampire attack is indeed troublesome. Some of them have believed in that vague prophecy and come to New York to cause trouble. We've sorted out this problem, but what if there's another prophecy next time? This time it was New York. Next time it'll be Los Angeles or San Francisco. This time we lost a bridge and hundreds or thousands of people were injured or killed. What about next time? Which bridge? Which building will be lost? Of course I know." Stark tapped the table with his metal-covered gauntlet. "The Security Council and Congress are not doing anything. If there is another disaster like this, we will have to rush in and then watch helplessly as the casualties are devastating. I want that to happen more than anyone else. Therefore, we need to solve this problem at its root." Stark squinted. He saw Schiller sitting there writing something. He said, "Aren't you being a little too calm? Why does this sudden invasion seem to have come as if it didn't surprise you at all?" "Good question, but that's not important." Schiller tidied the papers in his hand, then arranged them neatly on the table and handed them to Stark. Stark gave him a suspicious look, then awkwardly took the documents. He saw the title at the top and involuntarily read it aloud. Analysis report on the medicinal value of vampires. Medicinal value? Chapter 129, The Arbat Incident, Part 8. Stark spent about 20 minutes carefully reading through the report, then threw the stack of papers on the table and said, "It's all nonsense. Anyone who has received a college degree or higher in biology can see that this is complete nonsense. After all, I'm a psychiatrist with no background in biology, and this is just an outline. What exactly to fill in is up to you brilliant scientists." Stark hesitated for a moment, then picked up the report again. He said, "To a layman, it might seem perfectly reasonable, but it's actually quite outrageous. However, I just thought about it, and it does seem somewhat reasonable." Stark, clutching the report with a troubled expression, said, "Vampire blood contains immortality factors that humans can utilize? That's ridiculous. Anyway, could you explain that part in more detail?" Dr. Connors already said that their blood contains a magical factor that science cannot decipher, so I'll name it the immortality factor. That's not too much to ask, is it? Okay, that makes some sense, since you're the only one among these people who knows magic. Besides, Stark hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Are you sure this kind of factor can really grant immortality? Whether or not it can truly grant immortality is not important. What is important is whether you felt any impulse when you saw this conclusion. Or rather, what were you thinking when you asked that question?" Stark pursed his lips, lowered his eyes, and then casually put down the stack of documents, saying, "Okay, I admit, any human being would have this thought. How wonderful it would be if I could live forever. I'm not greedy, but I really feel that if I could have 500 years, no, just 300 years, if I could have a lifespan of 300 years, then I really could change this world." His Adam's apple bobbed. Then he turned to look out the window and said, "You're a devil." When I saw that sentence, I even had a fleeting thought of using some uncontrollable power to capture and study these monsters. "No one can resist this temptation," Schiller said. "Even a saint would feel a sense of sorrow when faced with a lifespan of less than 100 years. This is humanity. Humans often live short but brilliant lives, and we are often proud of it. But if it weren't so short-lived, wouldn't you be tempted?" Stark spread his hands and said, "Okay, so you're trying to use this method to convince Congress and the Security Council that they want to achieve immortality and then fight vampires?" "No, I wanted to use this method to persuade you." "Convince me? Convince me what? Isn't my resolve to fight vampires strong enough? Even without this temptation, I would still want to wipe them all out. The problem lies in the method of elimination. Your individual mechs are not very effective against them, but once you use large-scale armed forces, it will attract the suspicion of too many forces. But in fact, you have a better way to go." "What do you mean?" Schiller pulled a pair of headphones from his coat pocket, handed them to Stark and said, "I have an appointment with a guest. He should be in the conference room by now. Thank you for granting me the highest level of security access, allowing me to invite others over as you." "Wait, who did you invite?" Stark put on his headphones, then Schiller shoved him out of the lab. He had a very bad feeling. Stark said, "Don't tell me you invited some important figure from Congress here, my God. I don't know how to deal with them." "No, wait, I'm not going. Don't worry, it's not those politicians." Stark stared at Schiller suspiciously, but Schiller remained silent. They stared at each other for a long time before Stark finally said, "Damn it, you fraudulent doctor. You did this on purpose, didn't you? You tricked me out of my highest level of security clearance. Don't put it so harshly. You opened it up to me yourself." 10 minutes later, when Stark met Norman Osborn in the conference room, he covered his forehead and whispered into his headset, "I'm going to dock your paycheck. I'm not kidding. Why did you bring this old guy here? All right, now that he's seen you, it's no use if you don't want to talk. Listen, I want you to discuss a business deal with him." "Do business? Why would I do business with Osborn? Their technology is complete garbage." "That's not important. Go up to him now and shake his hand, and then I'll tell you what to do." Stark, his face dark with reluctance as if he were going to his execution, shook hands with Norman. Norman, however, didn't seem to mind. He was a typical American businessman, dressed in a suit and leather shoes, with some gray hair at his temples, but he looked very energetic. Norman spoke first, saying, "Mr. Stark, this is my first time at Stark Tower. It's far more advanced than I imagined. It's truly an eye-opener." Stark looked up and made a hum sound through his nose. Schiller said into the earpiece, Look at him. If you were even half as good at talking as him, I wouldn't have to go through all this trouble. I have heard that your company possesses a healing serum technology and intends to sell it. Stark could only parrot what Schiller said into his earpiece. That's right, but we'll talk about that later. Right now, there's a better deal in front of you. Would you like to hear about it? Norman's expression remained unchanged. He said, so the cure serum technology doesn't exist. Then what did you call me here to discuss? This technique certainly exists, but before we serve the main course, we should talk about the appetizers first. You should have heard about the incident at the Brooklyn Bridge, where hundreds or thousands of vampires attacked humans. That's right, the military also purchased a batch of weapons from the Osborn Group for this purpose. Stark pulled out a proposal and handed it to Osborn, then whispered into his earpiece. You're just going to show him that proposal? It's all nonsense. Norman has a PhD in biology too. You can't fool him. He's different from you. He was a businessman first and then a scientist. To Stark's surprise, after reading the plan, Norman did not point out the errors like a meticulous scientist would. Instead, his face began to light up, and he said, Mr. Stark, I never expected you to be so talented in business. Stark said, What? You think there's nothing wrong with this proposal? A brilliant hype idea, Norman concluded. Medicinal value. Yes, that's it. I love that word. This is a great opportunity. If we can really package parts of vampires' bodies into nutritional supplements or health products, we can definitely make a fortune. Think about it, raw materials are falling from the sky right now. Whether it's Congress, the military, or any other force, they will support us. But Stark said, I must remind you, we actually cannot crack the magical factor in their blood, and we are not even sure if it has the effect of immortality. Does it matter? Norman stared into Stark's eyes and said, The best thing is that it can't be cracked. If something can't be cracked, we can't fully prove that it's useful, so no one can fully prove that it's useless. Norman picked up the project proposal and flipped through it again, saying, Immortality factor? Indeed, the name might be a bit exaggerated, but it's not a drug, just a health supplement. The effectiveness will depend on the actual results. We don't need to promote it. Vampires are living examples. They can all live forever and heal quickly from their injuries. Everything that's happening in Brooklyn right now is the best advertisement. The whole world knows that there is a species that can live for hundreds or thousands of years and is fighting against humans with an extremely fast healing speed. Soon, the aftermath of this event will continue to unfold, and the whole world will know about the vampires' full-scale invasion of humanity. Their characteristics will be written on the front page of every newspaper. What is this? This is a massive, worldwide publicity campaign. What kind of advertising can match this level of reach? At this point, our two companies can join forces again. Industrial giant Stark and pharmaceutical giant Osborn. We can work together to prove that there is a mysterious factor in vampire blood that can extend human lifespan. It's very possible, right? After all, they are immortal beings. This could even open up a new industry, the study of the medicinal value of non-human species. Stark echoed Schiller's words. Not just vampires, but possibly other creatures in the future. What we need to do is use our scientific credibility to tell the world that these species have considerable medicinal value. That's right. Norman clenched his fist and said, That's what I think too. Once we succeed this time, everyone will believe that we have the ability to identify the research value of alien species. Indeed, just like you said, we can open up a new industry, which will bring unimaginable huge profits. Finally, Norman stood up without hesitation and said, I'll go and organize experts to improve this plan right now. Mr. Stark, I must say, while the idea is brilliant, your plan is not very professionally written. Seeing Stark's face grow increasingly dark, Norman continued, But I know that's because you want to see the sincerity of the Osborn Corporation, so you're doing this on purpose. I don't believe that the Stark Corporation can't even find a few biological experts. But that's to be expected. Your idea is already worth tens of billions in profit. I didn't expect that Stark Industries and Osborn Bio would start cooperating under these circumstances. But I want to say that this is definitely a good start, and you will understand that Osborn is one of the few trustworthy partners in the world. After saying that, Norman shook hands with Stark again and then hurriedly left. Stark was still a little confused. He said, What did he mean just now? I think he might have misunderstood something. It's all right, he's not wrong anyway. It's just that the biology experts hired by Stark Industries are busy saving the world. Salvation in a physical sense. Chapter 130, The Arbat Incident, Part 9. Behind the wreckage of a car, Natasha rolled away to avoid a bat's attack, then took out a strangely shaped gun and fired a shot at the bat. Instantly, blue ice crystals climbed onto the bat's body, then expanded into a block of ice, and a bat specimen frozen in the ice fell from midair. Natasha shook her hand and said, "I have to admit, this thing is better than I expected. The trajectory of this ice spike is quite accurate." On the other side of the road, Hawkeye was coordinating with Quake. Daisy slammed her hand on the wall of a tall building, and the group of bats crouching on the roof of the building took flight in a flurry. Hawkeye held a uniquely shaped bow and arrow, knocked it on the bowstring, aimed at the swarm of bats taking flight, drew the bowstring taut, and the bright blue arrow whistled past amidst ice crystals. In an instant, the extremely cold ice crystals exploded, forming a freezing whirlwind. The entire group of bats was frozen into ice blocks, and as they fell to the ground, they were torn into pieces along with the shattering of the ice. Hawkeye went up to investigate, and Daisy, the Quake, also came over. Daisy squatted down, fiddled with the ice blocks, and said, "It's amazing. Their healing factor is completely useless. After all, they're frozen solid, and there's no room for them to heal themselves. Whoever came up with this idea is a genius," Hawkeye said. Natasha said into the walkie-talkie, "Chief George told us to go support the main battlefield after we've dealt with the flank issues. The giant lizard's transformation effect is about to expire, and we need to rush to the rescue." As she spoke, she smashed a car door and got in. Hawkeye and Daisy got in together, and the group headed towards the front lines. Near the Brooklyn Bridge, as the sun gradually rose, the vampire's attacks began to weaken, and Connor's scales began to fade, causing him to shrink in size. He leaped and hid behind a tall building, then slowly returned to human form. Spider-Man swung over to him, tossed a backpack to Connors, and said, "Doctor, clothes." "Thank you," Connors said. His lizard-like features hadn't completely faded. His eyes were still vertical pupils, and there were still faint scales on his cheeks, making him look somewhat strange. But Peter said, "Doctor, you mustn't do such dangerous things again. Who knows if that serum will. As a researcher, you should have confidence in your research results. I believe everything is within a controllable range." Peter scratched his head and said, "Okay, I'll take you back now. Dr. Schiller seems to need to speak with you. You made that freeze gun?" Not entirely, I just made some improvements. I've discovered that you have a talent for cost reduction that most people don't possess," Dr. Connors praised. "You actually managed to mass-produce this amazing weapon. How did you do it?" Peter gave a wry smile and said, "Probably because we're poor." In the Stark Tower laboratory, Schiller and Stark were already waiting for Connors when he entered. Connors said, "The situation on the battlefield has improved since it's daytime now, but we're sure to have a tough night ahead. From what I can see, the mastermind behind the vampires seems to be gathering strength. He has brought in a large number of bats, probably planning to launch a general offensive tonight. Nick just called and said the vampires want to negotiate." "This is a delaying tactic," Connors said. "Can't Nick see it? Negotiations? Then what's the point of them continuing to send troops to Brooklyn? We all know their purpose, but there are quite a few dim-witted people among humans," Stark said. "They're not stupid, they're just greedy," Schiller said. "There are so many people in the world who would betray their race for personal gain, who would calculate defeat before they even know what they're going to do, who are both superstitious and fearful. It's not surprising that a few oddballs would emerge." "What did Nick say? Are we really going to negotiate with them?" Dr. Connors walked over and sat down, pouring himself a glass of water. In the past, this might have actually succeeded. The fighting had already reached a point where neither side wanted to suffer any more losses. The vampires were not in the right to start the war, but humans were at a disadvantage. The two sides were basically even, and all that was left was to divide the spoils at the negotiating table. Connors pursed his lips and said, "Yes, everyone's happy. Nobody cares about the casualties on the front lines. But I mean, that was the case in the past, and this time might be different. What other chance could there be? I think those people sitting in the congressional offices don't want to fight anymore," Connors said. "They've even started asking the police not to use overwhelming force." "What kind of nonsense is that?" Schiller took out a remote control and turned on a screen in the lab which was showing live news. On one side of the screen was a reporter, And on the other side was a congressman, who passionately declared, "We will fight this monster to the very end. Humanity will never back down." He wants to sit down and talk to us now? I tell you, it's too late. They must pay the price. Is this a radical faction advocating war? Connors asked. Schiller pressed a button on the remote and switched to another channel. A more portly, somewhat overweight politician sat on the sofa. He said, "We should look at this invasion from a more rational perspective. Admittedly, although the vampires were the first to invade, I believe there are reasons for it. They may have their own demands, and humanity should take this seriously." Before he could finish speaking, his phone rang in his pocket. He said, "Excuse me, I need to take this call." After a while, the somewhat overweight politician returned and said, "I just received some very distressing news." "Yes?" He brandished his fist and said, "These horrible monsters have caused the deaths and injuries of thousands of police officers. This is a terrible atrocity. This is an unjust war. We must fight them to the end. Listen, you damned monsters. I'm telling you right now, you're all dead. What's wrong with him? Why?" Then Schiller switched to another channel. This time, he was interviewing a very important person, as the background was the White House office. The interviewee said, "We are deeply saddened by this invasion, but the blood of those who lost their lives cannot be shed in vain. The vampires' violent acts will be punished with justice. The president vows to stand with all the people to face this disaster head-on and will never back down." "What on earth is going on?" Connors asked, puzzled. "Why are their stories suddenly so consistent and so forceful?" Connors wasn't the only one puzzled. In a dimly lit basement, Deacon, the radical vampire leader, said to his subordinates, "Find out what's going on. Haven't our lobbying efforts been quite effective? How did those damned humans suddenly change their minds so completely?" Then he cursed under his breath and said, "My plan was working. If we could just hold out until the daytime, humanity would be completely exhausted. Hurry, go and find out what happened." In the SHIELD office, Nick and Pierce shook hands, and Pierce said, "I know we haven't seen each other in a long time, but we can catch up later. Are you confident you can control this supply chain? My position on the Security Council requires your support. If SHIELD can have a supply chain that is not controlled by other forces, it will benefit both of us. This industrial chain can only be controlled by us because it is related to supernatural beings. I am very confident that I can persuade Osborn and Stark to work together to maintain it, while resisting pressure from other forces. That would be for the best," Pierce concluded. "Even setting aside future developments, the vampire and immortality technology industry chain alone can bring us unimaginable profits. It is an indispensable cornerstone for maintaining world peace, and we must do everything in our power to secure it. I believe you can do it, Nick. Of course, we have already obtained the preliminary plan from Osborn. To be honest, the person who came up with this method is a genius. The mystery of the supernatural creature and the characteristics of its outward appearance are enough to attract people to invest with a lot of money. Now that the plan is finalized, we need to hurry up and urge them to start production. Don't forget, the war is still going on and it's in full swing. If we can produce the first batch of samples before the vampires are completely wiped out, things will be much easier afterward." Pierce patted Nick on the shoulder and said, "Don't worry about the initial investment being too large. I think we can be even more aggressive, feed those swing voters, and shut them up with money. The main goal is to get the plan implemented as quickly as possible. Don't worry, even if SHIELD doesn't take any action, those who see the huge profits involved will spontaneously persuade their colleagues." "Which factions have confirmed their membership so far?" "The office on the south side." Nick Fury pointed to the left and Pierce said, "It really is them, those radical left-wing warmongers. They are indeed natural allies. All right, I won't bother you anymore. I know you still need to try to get more teammates. Oh, and I heard that a new batch of freezing weapons has appeared on the front lines. Could you get me one to take a look? I'm quite curious about it." "No problem. Those are a batch of freeze guns that Stark Industries rushed to produce, codenamed Blizzard. I can get one. I've never seen one before." After Pierce left, Nick took out his phone and called Schiller, saying, "Are you sure the Security Council won't suspect anything? After all, the timing of that bat monster's appearance is too coincidental. And since it only showed itself once and disappeared in a flash, won't that arouse the curiosity of those with ulterior motives? When we were making the plan, didn't you agree with it?" Schiller's tone was somewhat slow, clearly indicating that staying up all night had made him a little sleepy. Nick sighed slightly and said, "After all, if we wait for them all to flood into New York and then prepare to launch a full-scale invasion, we will be too passive and suffer even greater casualties. We can only take the initiative and lure them out. I just feel that this plan was a bit too hasty and will inevitably leave us with something to hold against us. That's your problem. You're the director of this Bat God's Descent drama. I'm just a stagehand." Nick chuckled and said, "Stageman? That's really interesting. This is the first time I've heard that term. You'd probably be the kind of stageman every director dreams of. You're a good director too, Chief Nick. It's a pleasure working with you." "It's a pleasure to work with you."